Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way. This is a podcast for serious writers who want to develop their skills in artistry and stand out in a crowded industry by taking intelligent, creative risks. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I hold a PhD in literature. I'm the author of numerous books, and I take a very analytical approach to art making, emphasizing both efficiency and experimentation. My guest today is Daniel Scott Tysdal. And Daniel and I were discussing writing exercises in the wake of the release of his book on creative writing, how to write poetry, called The Writing Moment. And The Writing Moment is probably, without reservation, I would say it is the absolute best textbook I have ever seen on not only poetry, but creative writing in general. I've never seen such a thorough book that is also very experimental, and yet covers a lot of the more conservative or traditional basics of writing poetry. It's really fun and engaging. Great book out of Oxford University Press. Excellent. Cannot recommend the book enough. There's a lot of information on my website about Tysdal's work and about this particular book. So I really recommend that you check it out. Go to jonathanball.com/5. That's jonathanball.com/5. And you can get the show notes, which include links to other information on my website. There's a review of The Writing Moment, a bit of a mini review there, and just some links to the book and so on. And Daniel's other work is really excellent as well. He talks about the book Vocational Poems in this interview. And he's talking about it like it's his next book coming out. But this interview is a little old. And so if you actually go out and get that book, it is published now. He's talking about it like it's not yet published, but it is published at this point in human history. So I can't recommend Vocational Poems enough. It's one of the best books I've seen in the last 10 years. There's a small group of poetry books that I think are just absolutely outstanding, essential reading in the last number of years. And I would say Vocational Poems is on that list for sure. So check out Vocational Poems, check out The Writing Moment. Daniel Scott Tysdal's got all sorts of other books that are really great too. One of my favorites, which is pretty influential on me, is a book called Predicting the Next Big Advertising Breakthrough Using a Potentially Dangerous Method. One of my favorite titles for a book. Predicting the Next Big Advertising Breakthrough Using a Potentially Dangerous Method. But Vocational Poems is a better book. So if you have to pick Vocational Poems, but I would recommend both those books. He's got other great books, really interesting writer. I hope you enjoyed this interview. And without further ado, here's Daniel Scott Tysdal. Daniel Scott Tysdal, thanks so much for doing this interview with me.
Sure,
and
thank you,
I see like this, wonderful array of books behind you. And so one thing I actually took all the books out of my office because I found their presence either distracting or crushing, like soul crushing, because whatever I was working on was just not as good as those books, or it just was less appealing. And, I found they were stealing my attention away.
Yeah.
So I actually moved all the books out of my office and put them on another floor of the house. And the only books I have in the office now is right beside my little area where I write. I've got the other books I've written, like and published. Oh. So that if when it's really like a slog, I can look at these books and think, no, I have done this.
Yeah.
I do know how to do this thing. But maybe I can get you to introduce yourself by just saying like how you kind of see yourself, I don't know, in relation to those books.
Well, I don't know if you've read my biography, but these are actually all my books. This is my life's work so far. I slowed down a little bit in the last few years. Part of the reason that I have the books here is partly out of necessity because half of them were stored on my parents' farm in Saskatchewan, which they sold 2 years ago. So that meant I had to find a new home for them. And I also like having them because it does make a nice icebreaker or even conversation starter with students when they come by. I always forget how scary office hours can be for students because I don't feel like a scary person, but I obviously understand that. And so I find that that's often a good way. Something catches someone's eye and they're like, oh, I read that, or I've always wanted to read that. And a lot of the books that I keep, I of course have them fiction, poetry, all sort of anally alphabetized. And I have my art books and comics and things like that at the top. And those are often the books that I go to when I'm writing and I'm stuck and I just need an image to kind of get me going. So sure. I try to use it I do get that soul crushing thing you're saying, absolutely. But I also do try to use it for inspiration.
Well, I actually, maybe I've done it really a poorly thought out plan. But in my university office at the University of Manitoba, I took all the books that I haven't yet read. I actually separated them out from the books I own and keep. I'm trying to be very selective with what books I keep now.
Yeah.
So I was very indiscriminate for many years. And after so many moves, it just started. It was like, I'm just going to stop keeping books.
Yeah.
Especially books I'll never read again. But I've got all these books I haven't read, and they're often books I'm excited to read. They're great books, but it would take me years to read through them all. So I actually moved them off. I felt like anxiety because I hadn't read them. So like, especially in my writing office, I felt like here's all this undone work, these unread books. I moved them physically off onto the university campus, and so my office is all books I haven't read. Yeah. So when students come, like it looks like this this display of intelligence and authority, but I've read none of those books.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So anyway, speaking of more specific books, you've got The Writing Moment, a textbook that you wrote recently, which is what I wanted to talk to you about. It's a really excellent book.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan.
I've been looking a long time for a book that I can use as a textbook in creative writing. And what I find consistently is, I think I mentioned it to you before, there's this problem that I see with writing textbooks, which is either that they're aimed too low, like at a really beginner writer who very quickly will move beyond that book.
Yeah.
And in many ways should be reading articles and not these books.
Right.
Or they're aimed at a kind of very high kind of pitch, so you're reading. The way I kind of describe it sometimes to people is you either are reading like an article on how to get rid of adverbs that's been expanded into a book, or you're reading Derrida. And there's this very small, or Deleuze or something like this. Yeah. And there's a very small kind of space in between where I don't find many books exist, probably for marketing reasons.
Right.
Ironically, you have this kind of weird how to write industry that to me has kind of made I guess a sort of mistake and maybe a non-money making sense. Like I'm sure it makes sense from a money making perspective, but there's a sort of weird mistake where it seems to me like a lot of the books about how to write are addressed to people who will never write consistently, or people who very much need something more complicated than that book. Yeah. So what I really loved about The Writing Moment, because I find this is especially a problem with poetry. So even when you do find a book about poetry that's very craft focused and practically focused, it will avoid the theoretical ideas that writers play with.
Yeah.
And so, or you'll kind of, again, you often won't. And the other thing is, even when you do find a very strong poetry craft book, it'll be extremely conservative.
Right.
It may be good, but you'll often be very conservative, and you won't really get a sense of the real range of writing that you can do. So what I really liked about The Writing Moment was you're pitching it in some ways at a beginner writer who's very serious.
Yeah.
And also you're talking, you'll go from, showing student work and talking about like what students have done to, having, here's a poem by Frank O'Hara, here's a poem, here's something that Shakespeare had done. Here's a sonnet, these traditional sort of ways of working. Here's, how to write a blank verse. And then you will discuss Zizek. You do discuss Deleuze and Guattari, but in a very comprehensible way.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's an interesting tightrope. And I'm wondering, so I'm going to get kind of back to that in a second. But one thing I wanted to just sort of ask you was, how did you actually come to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of, I guess, kind of two phases to that, because there was, the first of all, like sitting down to write a book on how to write poetry, which, needless to say, had never, ever crossed my mind. But we were actually having a meeting in my office here a few years ago. The creative writing group meets once a week here, and it's open to the creative writing students, to any student, former student who just wants to come hang out. And we happened to be having a really big meeting that day. I mean, we must have had 20-some people squeezed into my little office. And there was a very quiet student reading who was very funny, but we were all listening very closely. And we heard just a gentle knock on the door. And you could it was a sort of knock that someone was like, "Oh wait, is there someone in there? I'm not sure. I don't want to knock on a door with it." And so the student who's closest to the door opened it up, and this person who knocked on the door almost, we're up a level, almost literally like fell off, and fell like a story to her demise. And it turned out it was the acquisitions editor for Oxford University Press. And she didn't want to interrupt the meeting, but she basically said here's something they need and are interested in, and so would I do it? And I thought, no, but I said yes. You know what I mean? The way you always say yes to everything at the university. And then the next step, of course, is sort of how the book, as I did it, came about, was just looking at a whole bunch of sort of how to write poetry books and books that are multi-genre with a poetry component. And two things struck me. The first is what you've already said, that yes, you do need to give students these traditional elements. But at the same time, there's all these other possibilities. And you have a creative writing classroom, and everyone who does knows all the different things that the people in that room want to do. And so I wasn't seeing that in any of the books. And I also wasn't seeing books that were really getting students writing a lot. And so that when I kind of, I still had to pitch a book to Oxford. And so my little short line was practice precedes abstraction. And it was the idea that I would have these little writing moments, hence the title, that would just get the students right. So you're writing, now I'm telling you some things, and I'm telling you something else, and you're writing based on that. And then when you get to the end of the chapter, you could do more kind of traditional exercises. So it was once I knew there was a book that I wanted to do, then I was really like, okay, like I want to pitch this, and I hope they take it, because I would really like to write this book.
Sure. And so how did you actually start getting into the meat of how you would structure or design the books? Like, so for example, how did you decide or select what techniques you were going to focus on and the kind of types of writing you were going to focus on? Because it's very wide ranging. And you go from, like I say, very traditional forms, like metrical patterns, sonnets, of course, these enduring forms, but also you're talking about comic books. You're talking about concrete poetry. I've never seen, and maybe it's just my bad luck, but I've never seen a poetry textbook that discusses concrete poetry, like visual poetry of any sort.
Yeah.
Never mind that, using like references from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to, like other comic books, and also, Shakespeare. These are very traditional.
Yeah, so I definitely wasn't seeing that either. And so that was one of the main things I wanted. And that was something that got the Oxford excited as well. You know what I mean? Like that was something when it came back and it was accepted, that was something they said, yes, like please make that a serious part of this book. And so they also came, I was working under some expectations from them, and it was sort of like, I'm guessing this is the info that they were getting from creative writing teachers. And it was that they wanted a book that was about writing new poetry, was about revising poetry, and was about ways of, they're saying publication, but I present it more as like ways of sharing poetry, because talk about, cart before the horse or whatever, and so I did have that kind of model that they gave me. But yeah, as I was undertaking it, I was drawing a lot on, obviously, my experience in the creative writing classroom, and a lot too, I'm out at UT Scarborough, and we have a lot of great connections with the community. So I do community outreach, poetry workshops, so it's just literally like open to anyone from the community. And one of the things that I found on that front, and working with beginning writers here, was just how much poets can improve. Here's what imagery is. Here's what the music of poetry is. Here's what metaphor is. And you could literally do it in a couple hours, and people have suddenly gone from here as writers. And that's kind of what you're talking about. Yeah. It's like, if your creative writing textbook ends there, then people have read it in a day and they're ready for something else.
And they immediately don't need to reread the book. Like, that's what I find a lot of them, like, because I'm also looking for a book that I could read. That like I know what an image is. I know how to create a metaphor. I could get better at it, but how? Like that's where I feel a lot of it sort of ends. And so what I liked about the kind of structure that you've come up with was because you were getting into some of these philosophical ideas. You'll talk about I thought you had a very clever. I don't know how much you had designed it this way, but to me the patterning seemed to be you would pick a sort of technique that you were going to teach and you're going to cycle exercises around. And you'd also pick a broader kind of philosophical concept by way of illustration. So you'll talk about the sublime and what that is and sort of a bit of the tradition of how it shows up in poetry, both traditionally and even avant-garde experimental work, how they kind of approach the sublime differently. And then you'll hang very concrete exercise about, here's a type of, I forget the precise thing you talk about with the sublime, but here's a precise type of poem you can learn to write, but we're going to use these broad concepts. And so, one, you're tapping into the poetic tradition of philosophizing with poetry or through poetry. And two, you've got a very, practical thing that these people are doing.
Yeah. Yes, that was definitely, in the introduction, I talk about that, about the occasions of poetry that, I give my particular example of being at my partner's cousin's wedding and being asked to write a poem kind of on the spot, and just use that as a moment to show, beginning writers that it's always a process, but also to show this idea that, poems come out of occasions, that it's not just an idea, it's also going to be an emotion, it's also going to be a life moment, it's also going to be an artistic motivation. And as you're pointing out, once we have that kind of model in mind, you can then start pointing to specific traditions and start introducing poets to all of these different sort of paths that they can go down on that front. And I think, too, it just gets at, I think, what's key to teaching this material, and it's putting these things kind of in tension, or putting these things in relationship. So, you're not just doing an image, you're doing an image in relationship to the poem you're forbidden to write. Like, you're not just writing about meter, you're doing it in relation to the sublime.
That's one of the first exercises, the poem forbidden to write, if not the first one. And
it is, yeah.
I thought that was really, when I saw that, I was sold, because not only are you getting into the emotional aspect of, what is the thing that, personally, in some way you're forbidden. I think it taps nicely into a kind of emotional level. It also, you get into social taboos, and you get this broader level, which you can kind of start to connect to more abstractly to different philosophies. And it's also something that's applicable, as I say, like cross politics. So whatever your kind of, let's say, political belief in what poetry is or should be, that's a thing you can tap into. And it's also crossing you basically out of what you would do into the space where you're now doing something you're uncomfortable with. And I feel like that's a strain of the book too, which I really appreciated, this way that from the first exercise, you're really challenging people to do something they wouldn't normally do. And I think that works on the formal level as well. They're trying different approaches. And again, I appreciated the way that you crossed lines in that sense. And you've done that in your own practice. You do a variety of very different types of poetry. So it seemed, to really work in a variety of ways. So just to make this all a bit more concrete, like, what would be an actual process you should go through? Like, how would you write in a writing exercise? Like, in terms of forms or types of writing, like, how do you actually write a writing exercise? Because you've got a variety of them in this book. And, and again, like, just if we're going to talk, like, shop a little bit, as a writer who's either going to come up with exercises to utilize themselves, or as a teacher, which so many writers teach, of course, and teach creative writing. How do you actually go? What is the writing process of doing a writing exercise?
Yeah. A part of it kind of comes back to what we've sort of touched on, and it's I try to have sort of two components. That you have the sort of prompt, and then you have the sort of practice. That you have that aspect of the exercise that's going to stimulate someone's imagination, that's going to make them want to write, that's going to say yes. But then at the same time, that's also giving them some sort of, that it has that pedagogical aspect, that's giving them some sort of direction, and that's giving them access to this tool or this technique in a way that right away they can kind of just go with it. like one that I find has done led to good poems, or taken something difficult for students to understand and help them write with it, is taking the idea of the ideal image, of taking, that there's another aspect of the image that maybe we don't often talk about in creative writing textbooks, even though it's at the core of kind of all art. It's there from kind of Plato on, this contrast between what is and what could be. And so it can be a very abstract thing, even as I'm trying to describe it. And so the writing exercise that I have in the book and that I'd used previously with students just talks about, I was at the butterfly sanctuary, and I saw a woman who was covered in, she had butterfly earrings, butterfly thing in her barrette in her hair, butterfly brooches, butterfly pattern shirt. She was just like the woman who loved butterflies. She walked in there and was all in awe and wonder. And then like one butterfly came near her and she's like this, and then another one. And suddenly they were swarming her and she was screaming and having a panic attack and totally had to be hauled out of there. And so I give that as this concrete example of this meeting between the sort of ideal of what butterflies are and then the sort of real encounter with it. So, for some students, they can just take that and write a poem about that, but then it also gives them access, what are my experiences like that? Or what are other people's sort of encounters with that? So that's one example that I've had success with that I think is doing those two things.
Sure. So when you find something like that where, again, so let me just ask you a quick question about that particular example. So in that instance, did you at that time get compelled to write a poem about this butterfly experience?
Yes.
So, and then to what degree did you actually connect the exercise to the kind of process that you went through in reality?
No, it was definitely just the sort of beginning point.
Sure.
For sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and then when you are trying to kind of pick the technical idea to illustrate with the prompt, is that the instance where at what point, I guess, I'm asking, like, does it become unfocused? Like, how many things could you add to that writing prompt before it's no longer practical? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, that's definitely something I struggled with, and I mean, especially where. So as I said, the book is divided into writing moments and writing exercises. Those are really the two types of spurs that are in the book. And so maybe to give a more concrete example, we've been talking about the imagery ones. And so I'll talk about that too, because I think the imagery ones also, because again, right away, as you're saying with the poem You're Forbidden to Write, I just wanted to kind of lay it all out right at the start. And so one of the things that I also did then right at the start was, okay, we're talking about the image in poetry. So of course we think imagery. And so when we first meet imagery in that section, it's draw in your senses. And then, so every no matter who you are as a poet, the most conservative poet, this is where we start. And then the next prompt leads people to explore the symbolic power of imagery. Okay, yeah. And then it's the third that gets into this more abstract, the kind of ideal image. That's another type of image we work at. And now that I've sort of brought everyone kind of safely along, then I can make that turn at the end of that section and be like, but actual physical images as well, both in terms of ekphrastic poetry, writing about works of art, or also having poems that respond to images on the page, work images into the page, or use the image to reshape the very layout of the poem or the very shape of the page. And so that was one thing that I was trying to do, was to start somewhere accepted and comfortable and use that to show it's not a strange leap to suddenly make poems that look like comics, to use the example you gave, that this is all a part of the same continuum of poets exploring images. So yeah, then in actually writing those writing moments, that was definitely where I found myself, like when I'd go back and forth with my editor, that she was having to do work to either there's not enough kind of hands-on going on here, or you've just gotten so convoluted, you've basically just given someone like a recipe. You know what I mean? Like they're not even being prompted. They're just sort of like automatically, and there are a few in there like that, because I did want to play with that idea of the recipe as well, that inevitably people are going to tweak, but yeah, that was definitely something.
So what strikes me about that description of how you're kind of, I guess, say like layering one exercise or writing moment on the other is it's very much the structure that you'll see in a poem. When this stanza, it builds on the previous stanza, but develops it a bit more broadly or abstractly. You start from often a concrete place and move out to this broader, more abstract place, but then tie it together again with another almost epiphanic concrete image. So I was wondering to what degree you were intentionally doing that or modeling that building process with these writing exercises, or to what degree do you think is just maybe a natural way your mind works?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just seemed to me it seemed the most pedagogically sound, and it just seemed to me like that was the best way to then really get at, in a short span, that first section on image is whatever, 15 pages, maybe even less. So right then you could take someone really through the kind of history of poetry, of all of from the most sort of traditional in my body, writing about my senses, to a more kind of experimental approach.
So to kind of just disconnect from the book for a second and talk more about these writing exercises and writing practice, which is something you get into more later towards the end of the book. But one question that I have is often we're encountering these writing exercises in the context of a creative writing classroom or, of course, in a writing textbook. And I'm wondering what value you think writing exercises hold for non-beginner writers, like for people who are, let's say, have published books out. People who see themselves as maybe, being past the point of taking a class in creative writing, rightly or wrongly. But again, like maybe they have actual projects they're working on. Like, to what degree are these writing exercises a distraction, and to what degree do you see them as, kind of fundamental or integral, or just a value to a non-beginner writer?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the obvious answer is one answer, and it's just that I think it can push you in new directions. You know what I mean? That it can maybe get you writing or writing in a way you wouldn't necessarily, or think, writing about new things, all the things that come with that. But of course, a writer might respond to that and say, well, that's just why I read other writers. Fair,
Sure.
fair enough. But I will say, like, a lot of the people, again, these are writing teachers, but a lot of people who've been getting desk copies or teaching from the book, I've been getting a lot of nice feedback from people, not only saying that they're enjoying teaching the book, but also they're like, hey, yeah, I've been writing some new poems, and that they found that it has been something that is working and sending them in a new direction.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly found it interesting. I'm kind of, in terms of poetry, I don't write a lot of poetry anymore. It's a real misperception people have about me. I don't really consider myself much of a poet, or that I really write poetry. Like, and I'll even point to the poetry books I publish and argue that they're not poetry in various ways. But I have made a sort of conscious decision to go and like write some really classic poetic forms in particular traditional ways, which I haven't published really. I mean, I've done sonnets and things, but they've never shown up in my books and so on. So I find, like, at the moment, for example, I'm writing a sestina about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So, I mean, I want it to have a lot of these traditional aspects. So I found the book was just a good refresher in that sense. But also, there were really particular exercises that I don't know if they would really help me write this poem exactly, but I think they would kind of get me more into the space to write the poem, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like I've been finding it valuable, even as in some ways a distraction from a project. Because there's a sort of weird way you can work as a writer. It's unfortunate in some respects, but you can be doing all this work and activity, and on one hand, not be doing the thing you have to do, but on the other hand, almost have to do it in order to do that thing.
Yeah.
So I guess kind of a related question here is, like, do you actually do writing exercises like this yourself? Like, would you pick up a book like this book, or do you have like these exercises? Do you pick them up and just do them?
Yeah, I mean, well, the one thing that you've already hit on is, a lot of the exercises are just coming from either, it was fun to write this book because the one thing was writing or drawing exercises from poems that I have written or types of poems that I write. So it's like my chance to say, hey, here's a type of, especially with kind of more experimental kind of hybrid poetry. Now I can show people, hey, here's how you can do it, and here's how it's not so different than what we've already been doing. But it was also a chance because I would have ideas for poems, I think, but you don't have time to write all the poems you want. So suddenly you could sort of like put the seeds in there in the form of an exercise and have someone, hey, maybe at least someone else can write that poem. But yeah, I was doing a very basic introduction to just the idea of occasional poetry in my creative writing class. But I was just thinking too how much the students are into like speculative literature and fantasy and all sorts of things like this. And so I thought instead of assigning them, I show them here's occasional poetry, but instead I gave them the basic prompt. Instead, write a fake occasional poem or a false occasional poem, which I called, faux-occasional poems, like FAUX. Yeah. And sometimes, in the classroom, if people are kind of taking care of themselves, I'll just start writing my own poem as well with them. So I can throw my piece out there. And I actually ended up writing more of these fake occasional or faux-occasional poems. And that's actually my next book.
Oh, there you go.
That's coming out next fall. That's definitely that an exercise can take you in this direction that I never would have thought to have gone in a million years.
I find that so often the weird case where you'll have a very strict idea of like what you want to do as a project, but then actually something else will catch your eye randomly, and that will be what you do.
Totally.
Like, I wrote Clockfire that way. I just had this sudden image of like a clock on fire, and I just extrapolated out from that image. Which actually doesn't appear in Clockfire. It's suggested that it will appear later. But it never is described. And then, I kind of hit on this weird idea of, these impossible plays. And, it just kind of like starts barreling out from that point. And so I found like, it wasn't exactly a writing exercise, but it was very much this kind of throwaway thing that I had done, which almost unchanged, like except for two sort of major sort of elements. Almost the first draft unchanged ended up in the book, and then everything else was very much centered around the concept of that piece. But it was like this weird again, it was sitting in classroom thinking about some other thing that wasn't under discussion, and just this sort of thing comes in your head, and then you're off to the races in a weird way. But kind of along those, one other thing that I think is valuable in this book, you don't spend a ton of time on it, but you do get into something I've never actually seen or even really thought about, weirdly, which is doing an outline for a poem. Like if you have an idea, but you don't have time to write this poem, make an outline of the poem. I mean, it never even occurred to me to do that, which seems so obvious. Now that I see it, and that idea, I really appreciate that sort of idea as well. And so. One thing I'm kind of related to that I was wondering about was, say somebody has done an exercise, either just because they want to experiment with a particular different way of doing things, or they're in a writing classroom or whatever. For any reason, they're compelled to do an exercise. And you're so often in these exercises, you're producing things that aren't poems, but are like just little fragments or what have you. Maybe you just craft a particular metaphor or image. It's not, but it's outside of the context of being in a poem. Like, what are some strategies that you would suggest for actually moving from one, like how would you suggest a writer think about an exercise in terms of whether or not like what in that exercise would maybe compel somebody to move towards an actual draft, and then two, like what are a couple strategies for moving from like a very fragmentary piece to a fuller draft? Like in some ways that's what your whole book is about, but I'm wondering, if you have some particular tips or strategies you'd like to suggest to writers who maybe have just this fragment of an idea, but don't maybe know where to go to get it fleshed out in a manner of speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a hard question because that's broad. Definitely one of those things that, and I think varies so much poet to poet on sort of like finding what your kind of patterns are for bringing this, to bringing this to fruition. But I know for sure one of the things that I do encounter is, it's just this idea of like, what's worth keeping, or sort of like where do we go for the people who are just learning these sort of forms. One of the exercises I do in class actually is to give a prompt give a little writing moment, and people write it, try to write as much as a kind of short poem as they can finish. And then whoever wants to share, we go around and share. And then we pick one as a class. And then I, have the little projection camera, and we put that one up on the screen so everyone can see this person's draft. And now this is our sort of group poem that we're all going to share and write something kind of from this. And so I talk about, like, what for you is that kind of, like, gem of a line, which just that line that hits you is like, if all this is thrown out, this one line has to be saved. And is it a voice that you grow out of that? Is it an extended metaphor? Is it some kind of image? So that's one thing that people can do. Another option I give them is to sort of find a kind of structure in the poem potentially, and sort of turn it, play with the order of kind of what's already there. So that's another technique. And just talk about a few things that way. And then, because that's always a fun exercise, because then everyone's worked from that same source and even worked from the same strategies. And then hearing that, you can hear, oh, well, that's a way to go. I could have, giving people, another thing I might do there is giving people sort of structural shapes.
Sure.
Give it a kind of linear progression, give it a radial shape, give it juxtaposing, like using these, giving verbs, make the poem run, make the poem fly, and just using that as a way of giving it that. Yeah, because it's definitely something that you can see people struggle with. Beginner writers finding these shapes, and advanced writers not using your same 2 or 3 formulas that you've caught yourself suddenly using in the last 75 poems you've written.
On that note, one sort of thing that I wanted to ask you a bit more about, you touched on this really briefly in the book, but there is this common idea that writers need to find their voice or find their style. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you think of that, and to what degree these writing exercises can either, 1, help with that, or 2, help you avoid that, if that question makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think that writing exercise, because on the one hand, for me, in terms of types of poetry, like, I definitely tend to be a kind of everythingist. You know what I mean? Like, I think a poet should be able to do everything, and I mean that in 2 ways. Like, 1, you should be able to do everything. Like, you should be able to write like a Shakespearean sonnet. You should be able to write a sestine. You should be able to write all these forms. But you should also be able to create a structure in such a way that, maybe like throwing a trace of water across a rock and snapping a photo, or not, you know what I mean? Or, but that you should be able to think of that and work that as poetry. So on the one hand, I'm definitely have that approach of exercises as just being a way of adding more dimensions to that larger kind of choral voice that really we all have in us.
Stephen King has a book where he talks about having this toolbox, like a writing toolbox. So I often think exercise in that way. You develop a tool to throw in your toolbox. Maybe you use it later, maybe you don't. I mean, but it all depends. What I like about his metaphor is he tells this little story of how his grandfather, I forget who it was, his uncle or grandfather, went to go fix the screen door. And he brings this big honking toolbox over, puts it down, takes one tool out of it, fixes the thing, and then puts the tool back. And then King asks him, well, why did you bring the whole toolbox if you only need this one tool? And he says, well, once I was here, I might have discovered I needed there was some other job to do, or I had some other thing that I might need. So, and I like that metaphor of having to kind of carry this toolbox around, because what I find so often, and this is something at certain moments you kind of touch on this, but what I find so often with students, or even with really world-class professional writers, where they start to falter or fail, is if they are taking a sort of inappropriate style and trying to apply it to an idea. So it's something that they've had success with in the past, or it's just something that they maybe unconsciously think they have to do. Yeah, that's what poetry is. Or again, this is what I do. And suddenly you have an idea that it doesn't serve. So and I feel this is the problem that a lot of great writers fall into when they start to produce bad work, is they often have seized an idea that maybe is excellent, but it does not it's not served by their style, and yet they've developed this voice and this style, and they're trying now, consciously or unconsciously, they're applying it across to every idea.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's a success trap that writers can get into. But I think it's also a thing that many, kind of beginning or emerging, whatever you want to call them, writers get into almost by accident, because it's especially if you have a particular, maybe political idea of what you think writing is or should be.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And what I've found useful, in one way I've managed, hopefully, to avoid that kind of a trap. I guess it depends who you talk to, whether I avoid it or not. But like what I find myself doing a lot is mimicking experimental approaches, but not actually doing them.
Yeah.
So I'll often produce poems that people assume have been written under some conceptual or procedural constraint, but they haven't been.
Yeah.
I've just learned how to mimic that style. And so in some ways, there's reasons not to do that and to actually be more procedural and conceptual. But I think, one way to kind of escape the various traps you can find yourself in as a writer is to be doing these sorts of exercises, either, because you want to try something new, or just, again, kind of kick yourself out of the habit of doing the same thing over and over.
Absolutely.
Because you can be very successful doing that both creatively and, in other respects sometimes. And, but then if you get that idea that doesn't work, it just doesn't work for it. Now you're stuck and you'll often be miserable. Or you'll feel there's a problem, but you won't know what the problem is. And to some degree, I find I find a lot of writers, when I talk to them about what they're trying to do, they'll have this, very clear idea, but they'll have just picked some form or structure that makes zero sense to use.
Yeah, interesting.
For whatever reason, they'll have, and maybe they're just used to applying that, or they just have had the idea they wanted to write a sonnet, but then they started, producing something that would have, it just doesn't make sense to write in a sonnet form for some reason or other. I see it more common with haikus, weirdly, where, I don't know why, but so just talking about you as a teacher, I'm wondering if you found, now that you have a textbook out, what has your experience been like using this book in a classroom? And have you found any kind of unexpected ways to use it in the classroom? Maybe? Like things, obviously there's things you were intending to, hoping to do.
Yeah.
But in what ways have you found it maybe surprisingly useful? Or
well, really one of the things that this just shows me maybe not thinking enough about it, but one of the things that surprised me and that I've loved about it is just getting all that material into the hands of the students, because of course this is all stuff that I would always love to that we would cover and we'd be able to talk about, but of course each class would just be a little fraction unless I would be giving 20, 25 page handouts. And so now I'm able to assign a little bit of a section to read. So they come to class and we talk about it, or they go away after having talked about it in class and read more. And so now instead of us talking about a little bit of what would be in a section there, and then me assigning one writing exercise, they're now able to read through it all and then pick from, all the 4 writing moments or the 6 or 7 writing exercises. And so it's been neat watching people be able to craft their own kind of path through the book. Like having students who will find will find the way of hey, like I want to be more of an experimental poet, and so they'll gravitate towards those, and so they're still having to do some of the more traditional stuff, but they're also able to be like, whoa, what's a sound poem? I've never heard of a sound poem, and they're following all the links that I give them and trying their hand at that, and so I've definitely liked that they have all this material and they're able to have, I guess, a bit more ownership over it rather than me. I still am the gatekeeper, I guess, because I put the stuff in the book, but rather than me just pointing to these few things, they're able to kind of go with it on their own. And
have you found that this may be a weird question, but have you found it to be a problem in any way? Like, has it sucked your lectures away from you, or otherwise, has it just has it freed you up in the class, or is it restricted?
Yeah, so I am able to say these 2 things we didn't get to, you can go to page 18 and 22 and make sure you check that out, or if you're interested in more of this, because I use the book in such a way that I use part of it for the beginner level, and then I use part of it for the intermediate level. And so they end up not, they don't read the whole book in the one class. And there's still stuff that we don't quite get to. One of the I guess another kind of unexpected thing that was fun that came out of it was, since the students then were reading so many writing exercises and things like that, I said, okay, for next class, this is the intermediate class, I said, write your own writing moments, like write something in that style. And that's sort of maybe not covered in the book, or that you think should be covered in a new way. And I kind of almost wish I hadn't done that, because it's like, damn, these are good. you might not need me anymore. Y'all just get this book and then make your own exercises. And then so we did those, and then they handed them around, and they each wrote poems off their own prompts, and I wrote a poem off one of the prompts. And so that was definitely something unexpected too, was seeing them take that step towards being the instructor as well.
Yeah, I haven't used the book yet, and I'm going to use it next term in a classroom. But I'm very, looking forward to it, because, especially for poetry, like I say, I find it's just so hard to find a book. I don't know why it's so hard to find writing textbooks, because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
But so many of them are, one, focus on fiction, or two, again, have some weird political agenda, or just lack any sort of diversity for some reason. Or, as I say, they are too basic. And I feel that's a real problem, oddly, even for beginners.
Yeah.
Because I just don't see what benefit they get from a book,
Absolutely,
Frankly, like I'll see whole chapters sometimes devoted to how you shouldn't use adverbs. Well, that's like 5 words or something, like it's like a sentence. Don't use adverbs for the following reasons. And then you might tag 2 more sentences on there.
Yeah.
And then ignoring all the times you would use an adverb. Or again, like the reasons in more detail. And like realistically, like I find, like if you just give people a checklist of like 10 things that they can just do, they immediately improve. And then you can kind of go somewhere else after that point.
Totally.
I often tell students, like, if you just go through your writing and do like, a handful of really technical things, you can just instantly improve it.
Yeah.
And then we can kind of get into maybe, what else you can do to like improve at a more broader level. And then you can go back and just subvert all that stuff, that you had kind of taken as straightforward rules, like all the quote unquote rules of writing.
Yeah.
One, of course, there's this way in which they do help. But, eventually you can come back and subvert them. Yeah. But 2, there's this way in which, at the moment that they truly help, it truly helps to just accept without question particular, rules, like, avoid your passive voice, avoid, abstract verbs and so on. At that moment, you don't need the explanation, and you don't need to read a whole book about it.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's such a weird sort of, and so you get these books that are basically checklists, I feel. And I don't see why we need to talk endlessly about something like at the checklist level.
Yeah.
And then, and just from talking to writers and knowing writers, at the level where you start to become more confident, or, you're writing publishable work, those writers aren't thinking in terms of writing rules. Yeah. They may have certain things that they do consistently, or that they believe, make for good writing, or even that they tell students. But on their bookshelves are, books unlike theirs. Yeah. Books of philosophy. Yeah. Books of, general interest, it's all sorts of things that we don't necessarily, like you were talking about comic books, like you've got your poetry and then you've got all this other stuff. Yeah. Sitting on the shelf behind you. And I feel like a lot of writing books focus on, like if they're teaching fiction, they'll be, talking about, if they're teaching short stories, it's like, go buy some short story books, go read a bunch of short stories. Yes, that's great. But, why? And like, why wouldn't you go pick up a book by Zizek? Yeah. And, apply that, or just completely fail to apply it. But, wrestle with or even contend against those ideas in some way. So there's a lot of sort of weird, from my perspective, there's a lot of kind of myths about what's useful to a writer. at various stages. And then there's this way that, what I would like to call kind of non-beginner or serious writers, whether they are really beginning or not. There's a kind of a difference often between like the very serious students you can tell are going to keep writing, and the people who just are going to quit for some reason or other, either after they publish a book, which happens a lot, or before. And it's not that those people that aren't making good decisions or can't be served, but I feel like there's this lack of serving writers, who've got books out, and maybe are like you. Like, where's the book for you?
Exactly.
Because I'm sure you'd want to read it, So kind of, this is a broader question, disconnected a bit, but I'm wondering just what you think are some of the kind of core myths that writers believe. It's a very abstract question, but
I mean, maybe this one's probably too broad, and perhaps, it's inevitably a very personal question.
Yeah.
But I think for me, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot for a while, I won't even say lately, for a while, and it's just that it's kind of a twofold problem, and it's, on the one hand, it's that what we do as poets say, it doesn't matter, you should be apologetic. When you stand up at the mic, you should be bowing your head about not make crack jokes about not making any money, you should do that because we're just worthless. So there's that side of it, but then kind of weirdly connected to it is this obsession with the things that don't matter, as though that's the award, the nomination, or this, or who's reviewing that, or So there's, on the one hand, this sense of like, and I'm saying this not judging anyone, it's like putting it on me. I'm just like, oh, I'm a poet, I don't make any money off my poetry, and like, oh, the is your book gonna get, whose book is it, and it's like, I think for me that's something that is a kind of myth that I feel like I'm thinking about it more because I'm really living through it, like getting, you know what I mean? Like, I'm feeling like, two things have happened. One, a lot of it is just teaching, of just like how important the process is and how awesome the process is and how amazing writing poems is and sharing poems with other people who are writing poems. And it's just like, once you see that angle, then you're like, no, I'm not apologetic because this is amazing. Like, this is awesome. Everyone out there is not doing it. You should be doing what we're doing. And then there's also just forget all this awards, or forget who's getting mad at who on Twitter, or like, it doesn't matter. But you know what I mean? Like, and one of the things that really brought it kind of clear to me was at Christmas, my girlfriend and I were visiting her dad in Florida, and he's a real, he was in real estate, and he now runs kind of senior care stuff. So he's a real businessman, but he's always loved movies. He's always loved reading. He's got a huge bookshelf. And so he's a real fan of the arts at the same time. And we were watching a movie with him. I can't remember what it was. And Andrea, she said something to me, and then I kind of said something back. We're kind of talking at the level of craft. And he was just, what did you two just say? Like, what? He's like, wow. And then we kind of explained it to him. And it's stuff that, we would just, this is just how we think about this stuff. And he's like, you two have such a gift. Like, you are so lucky that you can see that and that you have the opportunity to show people that. And I just thought, wow, like, I'm such a jerk. I'm such a, you know what I mean? Like, and so that's a moment that really, really stuck with me.
So the only kind of other question I really wanted to ask you was, is there such a thing as caffeinated bread? Like, at one point in this book, you make some often remark to, it's the best thing since caffeinated bread. And like, is that real? Like,
I think it is.
Bread? Really?
I do. I don't think I was making that up.
That's like that's $1 million idea. As soon as I saw that, I was like, not only is that a beautiful poetic image, or some sort of, but that's a brilliant $1 million idea. Wow.
Well, hopefully, maybe it's not real. And does this? I don't know. Is publishing it count as like having the copy or trademark?
Can't copyright ideas. No, that's that was a revelation to me. There's all sorts of little weird gems in there. I don't know if that really is one, but it's certainly a brilliant image. But yeah, well, thanks so much, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to know more about this this book of yours coming out. You said it was this fall or next fall?
So
I guess this
fall
fall's
2015.
over,
Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. Well,
Sweet.
what's the book called? Do you have a clear title?
Yeah, so I am going to stick with the title. So these fake vocational. So it's called vocational poems.
Okay, great.
It starts at it moves in kind of chronological order from year 0 and then ends again at future year 0. So.
Oh, excellent. And there you go. A book born out of writing moments.
Yeah. Hopefully it's good.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. This is a lot of fun.
Great. Well, talk to you later.
So that was Daniel Scott Tysdal on writing exercises. Again, I really recommend Daniel's books, especially The Writing Moment and Vocational Poems, the 2 books we kind of talk about in the interview. If you go to the show notes online at jonathanball.com/5, you'll find links to those books and to other things related to what we talk about in this interview. So again, that's jonathanball.com/5. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks to Daniel for being my guest. Thank you for what you're going to do next, I hope, which is give this show a rating, give it a subscribe, give it a review. Even if you hate it, it still helps to give it a review from my point of view, because I guess then you don't want to help it, but the algorithms really like ratings, the algorithms really like reviews. That kind of stuff really helps people find this show. So thanks very much. I really encourage you also to just make writing exercises a regular part of your creative practice. So I've talked about creative practice and writing schedules, pretty extensively. If you go to jonathanball.com/schedule, there's all sorts of information about, getting a creative writing schedule going. My most popular blog post is at that link, jonathanball.com/schedule. It's all about why you should have a writing schedule. I really think writing exercises are a great thing to do inside your writing schedule, especially because they're low risk, so you can just kind of get going rather than a big, giant, weighty project that maybe you're going to procrastinate on or you're going to find intimidating. Why don't you just start your writing session with a bit of an exercise, something that's fun, get a copy of The Writing Moment, do the exercises, and then just kind of segue out of that into maybe your more serious, massive project. Oftentimes, like Daniel himself, talks about, vocational poems, for example, grew out of the exercises he was doing sort of in class and, developing for The Writing Moment and so on. Really worth checking out writing schedules if you haven't already instituted one. So again, jonathanball.com/schedule. They'll give you a bunch of information about why you should have a writing schedule. And also on my website, of course, you can sign up and get a free ebook that's going to tell you how you can create and maintain a writing schedule. Because often when you have a schedule, it's still hard to maintain it. And I've found a few things that really help quite a bit just by taking into account, trying a lot of different things, learning what kind of works and doesn't work. Everybody's different, but there are some basic concepts like psychological triggers and how they could work for you in a positive way, as opposed to the sort of negative way we always think about being triggered. In any case, jonathanball.com/schedules where you can get more writing schedules. jonathanball.com/5 is where you can find more about Tysdal and his books, because that's where the show notes for this episode are. And also, this is an interview that has an accompanying video, Skype video, talking heads on Skype. So if you prefer to watch that at some point, or want to share that, go to jonathanball.com/5. Thanks for listening. Keep writing the wrong way.